Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy because the IMF has just released its updated forecasts for the whole of the global economy and it's downgraded Russia significantly. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, the IMF, aren't they the guys who bail out all of the countries that are bankrupt? Well, they are. That's what the fund was established for. But it's also known for producing really detailed information and forecasts and research about most economies in the world. That's basically what it does. It spends time working with all of the economies, looking at all of its forecasts, going through all of everything that's happening in that economy, and then establishing basically a full database of every country in the world. And unfortunately for Russia, they've just received a very serious downgrade. Now, before we get into the details on all of that, I'd just like to ask anybody that isn't fully subscribed to smash that subscriber button now, because I know more than 50% of people that watch my videos are not subscribed. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does help me in terms of the algorithm and also making me feel a little bit happier. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. And I'd also like to give a quick shout out to 3 of my members. So one of my members on YouTube has just upgraded to legend status, and he's the only one. His name is Gerald. I won't give his surname because I don't want to embarrass him, but if you're watching, Gerald, thank you very much. And I've got 2 people on Patreon who are also at the very top level, and they are Lynn and Michael. So thank you so much to you guys for your support, and also everybody else. I'm not looking to single them out particularly, but I just thought I'd give them a quick hello. And whilst we're on the topic of sponsorship, I want to talk about today's sponsor, NordVPN, because VPNs are actually an absolutely fantastic tool. I use them all the time. Now, the main reason why you'd sign up for a VPN is because it protects you online. Unfortunately, cybercrime is on the rise. Everybody is under attack. Every time you go online, you run the risk of somebody hacking into your accounts, stealing your passwords, and potentially stealing your money. But with a VPN, you'll be protected every time you go online. And NordVPN offers a feature called Threat Protection that blocks access to websites known to host malware, including ransomware. But one of the other really exciting things about VPNs is that they give you access to a world of entertainment. You can access movies and TV shows and sports matches that are not available in your region. All you need to do is change your location and access all of that entertainment and information. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get an extra 4 months on a 2-year plan by going to nordvpn.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link below. This table, taken from the IMF's World Economic Outlook posted in July, shows the year-on-year movement in GDP for 2023 and 2024, and then has projections for 25 and 26. So you can see right at the top here that the global economy grew by 3.5% in 23, 3.3% in 2024, and is now projected to increase by 3% in 2025 and 3.1% in 2026. And the column alongside here shows the difference in the July forecast compared with the forecast that was posted in April 25. So you can see that for the global economy, there's been an increase of 0.2% in 2025 and 0.1% in 2026. However, if we run down and have a look at what's happening with Russia, they haven't fared so well. You can see that in 2023, the Russian economy increased by 4.1%. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that that was as a result of Russia pivoting and becoming a wartime economy. Lots of companies are now sponsored directly by the Kremlin, and they're being paid guaranteed income to produce things for the war in Ukraine. And in 2024, the economy achieved 4.3% growth. So that's actually looking pretty healthy. If we compare that to the United States, the US achieved 2.9% in 23 and 2.8% in 24. Now, obviously, the US economy is significantly larger than Russia, so it's harder if you've got a bigger economy to achieve significant growth. And also, Russia was coming from a very low base level in 2022. So the 2023 figures were measured against a much lower figure. But if we look at the euro area, you can see that in 23, it only achieved 0.5% growth, and in 24, 0.9%. So at face value, it looks like Russia is doing better than the USA and Europe. And if we have a look at what's going on in China, you can see that they did 5.4% in 23 and 5% in 24. However, if we look at the projections for 2025, it's now a very different story. Russia is now projected to grow at 0.9% in 25. And if we compare that to the 3% growth for the global economy as a whole, Russia is obviously significantly off kilter. And if we look at what the forecast is for the US, it's 1.9%. For the euro area, it's 1%. And for China, it's 4.8%. So Russia is significantly lagging behind the rest of the world. And in 2026, it's forecast to only grow by 1%. And if we look at the next column, which shows the downgrade from the previous projections posted in April, you can see that the 2025 figure represents a reduction of 0.6%. So previously, the IMF was expecting Russia to hit 1.5% growth. It's now saying it will only be 0.9%. So the key question here is, why has the IMF downgraded Russia's forecasts so significantly in such a short space of time? Well, there are multiple reasons for that. So we'll go through the details right now. But basically, what's happening is the wartime economy is running out of steam. It just won't keep producing more and more GDP for Russia forever. Now, if we have a look at what's going on with GDP, you can actually see the slowdown. This is actually the official figures that have been published by Russia. So these aren't figures that we're just pulling out of thin air. And these are quarterly figures. So they're posted every 3 months. But unfortunately, the most recent data that we've got so far is for the first quarter of 2025. So up until March, we don't have the figures through to June yet. And you can see that the figure for 2025 was only 1.4% growth. We go right back to 2022. Now, obviously, that was the time when Russia was hit by the sanctions, and so the Russian economy was badly affected. So you can see that in the second quarter of 2022, GDP fell by almost 4%. In the third quarter, it was down by around 3%. In the fourth quarter, it was down by around 2%. Now, in 2023, things started to improve as Russia pivoted and became this wartime economy. So the Kremlin was paying all of these companies to make things. So therefore, those companies had guaranteed revenue, guaranteed profit. They were paying tax. And so GDP started to pick up again. But the key issue there is that this wasn't external sales. The money coming into the Russian economy wasn't coming from overseas. It was coming from the National Wealth Fund. And as you'll know if you follow the channel, the National Wealth Fund has been severely depleted over the past 3 years. But you can see in the second quarter of 2023, the GDP growth increased by around 5%. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that when you're comparing this growth rate, you're looking at what happened the previous 12 months. So you can see that in the second quarter of 2022, it was down by around 4%. So compared with that, it's easy to record some growth. But it was very positive growth. And in the third quarter of 2023, it was up by over 6%, 6.2%. But as you can see, since that time, things have started to wane. So over the past 7 quarters, we have seen a steady and gradual reduction in GDP growth. But the most recent quarter is the most significant shrinkage. And this is one of the reasons why the IMF has now downgraded the forecasts for Russia for 2025 and 2026, because they are saying that the wartime economy will not keep boosting GDP, and therefore Russia is now going to grow at a much slower level. Now, one of the other factors that the IMF has taken into account is what's going on with interest rates, because interest rates are extremely high in Russia right now. This chart shows the movement over the past 3 years. You can see that 3 years ago, interest rates were sitting at 8%. They then came down to 7.5%. Now, in the general context of interest rates, 7.5% is still extremely high. If you compare that to the West, most countries in the West have interest rates today of somewhere in the region of 4, maybe 3, maybe 5% if things are quite bad. but certainly not 7.5%. That's actually an extremely high level for most countries. Most countries haven't had interest rates for 7.5% for a very long time, if ever. So 7.5% was the base level. However, at the end of 2023, the Russian central bank started to hike interest rates to try to counter what was going on with inflation, because inflation was getting out of control. And by 2025, interest rates were up at 21%. And 21%, if you think about that in the context of your own budgeting, if you took out a personal loan, maybe to buy a car or go on holiday, or maybe you were getting a mortgage, you certainly wouldn't do it if the interest rate was 21%. And that's the base rate. If you were going to the bank, they would want to add some profit margin on top of that, probably another 3 or 4%. So you'd end up paying 25%. That's just not manageable for most people. So these level of interest rates are penal, and they stop companies and individuals borrowing money. Now, the Russian central bank is under pressure at the moment from President Putin to reduce these rates, because it is reducing the growth in GDP. And over the past couple of months, we've seen the rates coming down, and the current rate is 18%. But 18% is still off the scale. It's still one of the highest interest rates in the world. So this is another factor why the IMF have reduced the forecasts for Russia, because at those sort of rates of interest, no company is going to be borrowing money to invest into growth. Everybody is basically trying to pay off the existing debt that they've got. Now, one of the reasons why interest rates are so high is because of what's happening with inflation. So this chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation over the past 12 months. And one thing to note about this chart is that the scale on the right-hand side does not start at 0. It actually starts at around 8%. And as you can see, in the last 12 months, interest rates have been above 8% in every single month. And if you put that into the context of the USA, for example, where the target rate of inflation is 2%, 8.5% inflation is off the scale. But that's what Russia has been dealing with for the last 12 months. And you can see that at the start of 2025, inflation really started to get out of hand. And by March, it was up at 10.3%, double-digit inflation. And the problem with double-digit inflation is that if prices keep going up, then everybody's got less money. Everybody feels that they're less wealthy, and so they spend less. They're worried about making ends meet, and that doesn't help grow the economy. So when you look at what's going on with inflation, it doesn't make sense for GDP to be increasing. Now, over the past 3 months, inflation has started to come down, but only slightly. And at 9.4% for the most recent figures, it's still extremely high. That is higher than the USA has seen for a very long time. In fact, when we were up at 7 or 8% inflation, everybody was panicking that things were out of control. But for Russia, if we expand the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that inflation has actually been out of control for a very long period of time. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, inflation was up above 16%, and it remained in double-digit territory for the whole of 2022. We saw a slight reduction in the first part of 2023, but it then bounced back again, and there's a question mark over whether or not that reduction is realistic. When you look at the shape of this chart, it doesn't feel like they were correct figures at that time. But over the last 18 months or so, inflation has been pushing the 10% level. And year on year, the impact of this 5-year period of high inflation is that it devalues the ruble, the purchasing power goes down, and therefore there's a lot of pressure on budgets. And so GDP shouldn't really be increasing that rapidly. Now, if we have a look at what's been going on with wages, because this is another factor that the IMF have built into their modelling, and one of the reasons why they're cautious about what's going to happen in Russia over the next 18 months. So you can see that back in 2022, Russia was actually seeing negative wage growth. So wages were being cut at that time. We then saw a bounce back, and since the middle of 2023, we have had very high wage growth in Russia. Now, one thing to note here is that this chart shows real wage growth. So that's the movement year on year over and above what's happening with inflation. So you can see that in the middle of 2023, real wages were increasing by more than 12%. When you add that on top of what was happening with inflation, which at that point was sitting at around 5 or 6%, you've got 18% increase in wages. And over the last couple of years, it's maintained a very high level of growth. Now, if we look at the most recent data for May 25, you can see that year on year, real wages increased by 4.2%. However, that's on top of the 9.4% inflation that we've currently got. So when you add the two figures together, wages year on year are increasing by more than 13%. That is extremely high, and that is obviously higher than the level of inflation. And this is one of the problems in the Russian economy right now, is that there's a shortage of people. And so the Kremlin sponsoring lots of businesses and paying them guaranteed revenue to make things for the war in Ukraine is pushing up wages across the board, and meaning that all of the other companies that are not involved in this program are now short of staff and having to pay their staff a lot more because the wage market has gone up. And so this is causing major problems. And if we look at what's happening with unemployment, you can see that over the past 3 years, there has been a significant reduction in unemployment. 3 years ago, the unemployment rate was sitting at 3.9%. Today, it's down to 2.2%. And you might be thinking, well, surely that's a good thing. If we've got low level of unemployment, everybody's got a job. But that isn't the situation. The issue in Russia isn't finding a job. It's actually finding people to fill the vacancies. There aren't enough people because of what's happening with the war and the mass exodus of people that was seen at the start of the war. They don't have enough bodies to actually do all of the labour. And that is a major problem because it's pushed up wages and also means that there's a lot of empty jobs. Now, in terms of what's happening with the ruble, because I know everybody that watches the channel is always interested in what's going on with the ruble, the current exchange rate between the US dollar and the ruble is sitting at around 80. And that compares to a level of around 100 that we saw at the start of 2025. So the ruble has actually strengthened significantly over the past 6 or 7 months. And normally that would represent a positive thing in terms of what's happening in the economy, because, as I've said many times before, when your economy is doing well, lots of companies want to deal with your companies, and so they have to buy your currency, pushes up the demand for your currency, therefore pushes up the value of your currency, and so a strong currency usually indicates a strong economy. But that isn't the situation in Russia, because there is a complete disconnect between what's happening in the economy and what's happening with the ruble, because the ruble isn't used by many of Russia's trading partners. Nobody wants to pay for anything in rubles anymore. So they're having to take payments in Chinese yuan and euros and dollars and things like that, because nobody is really wanting to hold rubles. Nobody wants to deal with Russia long term. There's all the threats of additional sanctions being thrown around by Donald Trump. So the ruble, whilst it has technically strengthened in value, in reality, that isn't reflecting what's going on in the Russian economy. So despite the fact that the ruble's done really well, the IMF have significantly downgraded the Russian economy and the expectations for 2025 and 2026. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I know a lot of viewers are really interested in what's happening in the Russian economy, and we are starved of good quality information. The Russian government does not publish all of the data that it was publishing prior to the war in Ukraine. So we don't get up-to-the-minute information about what's happening on a daily basis. But what we do get is research that's published by entities like the IMF. And the IMF, in its most recent publication, has significantly downgraded the forecasts for 2025 and 2026 for the Russian economy. And as we saw from the data at the start of today's video, that isn't because they've downgraded every country in the world. This is specific to the Russian economy. In fact, the global economy is expected to grow by 3% in 25 compared with 0.9% for Russia. So Russia is significantly lagging behind the rest of the world. And the most recent figures represent a massive downgrade from 1.5% to 0.9% for 2025. And the reasons for this are multiple. Firstly, there are major problems going on in Russia with regards to its employment. They don't have enough people to fill all of the jobs. And so companies are struggling in terms of productivity and output. And if your companies aren't actually able to make as much stuff, then obviously they can't sell things. They won't make as much profit. They won't pay as much tax. Therefore, they won't contribute to GDP. But it isn't just that. Obviously, the sanctions are now starting to ramp up against Russia. Since Donald Trump took over as the president, we have seen a gradual increase in both tariffs for the USA, but also the threat of sanctions getting harder and harder on Russia. And currently, we're in the period where Donald Trump has given around about 10 to 12 days for the war to be concluded. And if it isn't, then there will potentially be a 100% tariff applied on all of Russia's trading partners. So, what that will do potentially is cut out all of the sales to India and China. And that would represent a complete disaster from Russia's point of view. And in addition to all of that, we've got really high levels of inflation in Russia, which have been pushing up prices and reducing people's spending power. And overall, that will reduce your GDP, because if people are worried that they don't have enough money to put food on the table, then they're not likely to go out and buy a new sofa or a new car or go on holiday within Russia, all of those sort of things. So we're seeing a contraction in spending. One of the reasons for that is because of what's happening with interest rates at the moment. They're currently sitting at 18%, and they've been above 20% recently. And that is just not conducive to people taking on any debt, borrowing money, moving house, all of those sorts of things. And from a company point of view, you wouldn't want to take on new debt to invest into a new facility or expand your current production or to buy another business or to invest in other markets, because why would you want to take on borrowing at more than 20%? And the other problem, obviously, from Russia's companies' point of view, is that they've seen their markets contract hugely. They can't get to as many markets because the financial sanctions are constantly being upgraded. There's more and more pressure being put on Chinese and Indian banks and institutions to make sure that they're not dealing with any sanctioned counterparts. That's causing payment problems. It's causing lots of companies overseas to not really want to deal with Russia because it's too much of a headache and you're running the risk of being hit with sanctions. So the overall summary of today's video is that the recent data published by the IMF shows a huge downgrade for the Russian economy for 2025 and 2026. This is now the end of the wartime economy. The IMF believes that it's run out of steam and that Russia will see significantly lower growth than the rest of the world. It's really a problem from Russia's point of view because the sanctions are getting worse. There is a real risk that they may start losing some of their sales to India and China as a result of the secondary sanctions. And all of this is now coming to a head for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. And here's something to put a smile on your face.